Roman Abramovich at some point even acted as a mediator in the failed Russo-Ukrainian peace talks early in the war. Evidently, sanctions are heavily harming Russian oligarchs, particularly those with links to the West, and some of them have voiced their concern. But the general Russian public is supportive of the war in Ukraine. According to polls conducted by the independent think tank Levada operating in Russia, 76% of respondents stated their support for the Russian invasion, a meager 5% drop in comparison with March. Even the continued shelling of civilian areas of Ukraine and evidence of the brutality of the Russian troops did not do much to decrease the support for the war. Some analysts question how firm that support is, and if the Russians are ready to actively support the war effort. Following the Russian withdrawal from the Kyiv Oblast, it was revealed that hundreds of Ukrainian civilians had died in the town of Bucha during the Russian occupation. Even though Russia deflected the blame onto the Ukrainians, whom they accused of organizing a spectacle and a provocation, all the evidence points to a Russian-organized massacre. According to the UN report, as of August 21st, 5,587 Ukrainian civilians had been killed and 7,890 had been injured since the start of the war. The UN also stated that as of August, 7 million Ukrainians have fled the war. Thousands of Ukrainian children were kidnapped to Russia for adoption. The human suffering caused by the Russian invasion is difficult to measure and account for, but it is clear that tens of thousands have died, millions have fled, and hundreds of villages, towns, and cities have been destroyed or heavily damaged since the start of the war. Following the failure of the strategy to shock Ukraine into submission, the eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass, which has been a zone of conflict since 2014, became the main focus of the Russian offensive. This prompted the Russian government and propaganda to reinvent their justification of war. Denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine remained somewhere in the background in their messages, while the so-called liberation of DPR and LPR became the emphasis. It seems like at this point, reaching the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts became the minimum program for the Russian command. In mid-April, Russia restarted its offensive in Donbass. The Russian strategy was the usual one, massing an excessive number of artillery in a relatively small area and embarking on a massive artillery shelling campaign, turning target cities and villages into rubble. At this point, the main advantage of the Russian army over the Ukrainian army was the numerical advantage it had in terms of artillery. This allowed Russia to have its most successful period of the war between April and early July. Russia made steady progress in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts throughout this period. While Ukraine managed to stabilize the situation on all other fronts, it was suffering in Donbass. The Russian Donbass offensive culminated with the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk by early July. Luhansk Oblast was under complete control of the Russian army, while it continued its progress in Donetsk Oblast. Ukraine's losses in this period were heavy, as in June, Zelensky stated that Ukraine was losing up to 200 soldiers every day. The Ukrainian government regularly requested more advanced military equipment to stop the Russian advance, including high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, and in June, the United States finally started supplying Ukraine with this system. HIMARS precision fire by 6 rockets has a range of up to 80 kilometers, and this gradually changed the situation on the battlefield. Armed with HIMARS, Ukraine started regularly targeting ammunition and oil depots, as well as command centers of Russia in the rear, destroying the supplies necessary to continue the Donbass offensive. Very soon, Russia's advance came to a halt. Throughout July and August, the Russian army tries to advance on Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka, but their gains have been minuscule. Since July 16th, Russia has managed to capture only 450 square kilometers of territory. HIMARS did not only enable Ukraine to stabilize the situation in Donbass, it has also allowed them to plan counter-offensive operations with use of the HIMARS in mind. After months of destruction of Russian ammunition and oil depots on the southern front, and key supply points like the Antonivsky Bridge in Kherson, Ukraine finally launched its long-awaited counter-offensive. Ukraine has made decent progress in the counter-offensive, which is ongoing as we speak, advancing towards Kherson from 3 different directions. The problem in this for Russia is exacerbated by the difficulty to supply its troops fighting on the western bank of Dnipro in the Kherson Oblast due to the destruction of key bridges. But the most successful Ukrainian counter-offensive was launched in early September in a completely different direction. Russia has been redeploying its units from the area west of Izium to other directions perceived as more important, which Ukraine has been able to exploit. After sending more troops and military equipment to this area, which the Russian command somehow missed or ignored, Ukraine has conducted its most successful operation of the war yet. Ukraine has liberated Balaklia, most of Kupiansk and Izium, while advancing on Liman. Kupiansk is of a particular strategic importance due to being a key supply hub for the Russian war effort in Donbass, which fell to the occupiers in the first days of the invasion. Russian military bloggers have claimed that their front in Izium has collapsed, and the situation of Russian troops fighting there is dire. Ukrainian counter-offensives show that after months of defending and reacting to the Russian movement, Ukraine has managed to capture initiative and momentum on the battlefield for the first time in this war. We should not forget that Ukraine has been the biggest victim of this invasion, as its people continue dying in defense of their country, while their cities, infrastructure and economy continue being destroyed. But this war has been consequential to so many other countries that we can say it has already had a global impact. With natural gas prices being over $3,000 per cubic meter, a major increase since the start of the war, inflation has become a common problem for Western countries, and inflation has become a significant discontent in the West. For now, European governments are bracing for a difficult winter by enacting austerity measures, and in some cases, unfortunately, going back to environmentally harmful practices, like using coal-fired power plants. But experts note that gas storages of most European countries are over 80% full, which should be enough to pass the year without a crisis. The war has also caused a major disruption of international grain trade. Ukraine is one of the biggest grain exporters in the world, and the Russian control of the Black Sea caused risks for shipping of grain to international markets. Russia is one of the biggest fertilizer exporters in the world, and in response to sanctions, it restricted their fertilizer exports. This led to fears of global grain shortage, which could have led to starvation in the poorest countries of the world. Thankfully, on July 22nd, Ukraine and Russia agreed to a grain deal, which was brokered by the UN and Turkey. Russia agreed to deblockade Ukrainian ports and allow grain shipments to go to international markets, while also concurring to restart fertilizer exports. Recently, Putin accused Ukraine of shipping most of the grain to Western countries and threatening to restrain the deal. Another process with potentially disastrous global consequences is related to the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant. In March, Russia captured the power plant. In August, sides started blaming each other for the shelling of the power plant. After weeks of negotiations, a visit by an IAEA delegation to the power plant was agreed upon. In early September, this study visit was concluded, and the IAEA made quite a neutral statement describing potential risks and calling sides to agree to cessation of all hostilities in the area. We'll continue following the situation around the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant and hoping that a prudent solution will be found to this issue. What is next for Ukraine and Russia? For the first time since the start of the war, Ukraine has momentum and initiative on the battlefield. Russia is suffering from a shortage of troops on the ground, as the invasion was planned as a short and victorious campaign. This shortage of troops has reached such levels that even the best Russian unit, the Wagner, has been trying to recruit Russian prisoners to join their mercenary unit. HIMARS is decimating Russian military infrastructure and supplies, and has already inflicted significant harm on Russian firepower. Russia has tried to respond to these issues by energizing its campaign to hire more contract and volunteer soldiers throughout its vast territory as part of its crypto mobilization efforts. The Russian new Third Army Corps has already been deployed in the most problematic areas of the battlefield, such as northern Donbass, to stop the Ukrainian advance. Furthermore, the Kremlin has adopted measures of economic mobilization, as now the government has a right to order workers of state institutions to work overtime without payment, and order enterprises to start producing military equipment. But low morale, poor military command, ever-present supply problems, and the unclear endgame of the Russian military strategy in Ukraine causes serious doubts about the future of the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. On the contrary, Ukraine's military situation has never been better since the start of the war. Continued Western support, effective use of new Western supplies like HIMARS, and the willingness of the Ukrainian government, army and society to fight the war until victory has allowed Ukraine to capture initiative in this war. The full impact of this Ukrainian advance on the war overall is not yet clear. But one thing is becoming more and more clear. The Ukrainian army is getting stronger due to more and better military equipment being given to it. The United States is considering giving fighter jets to Ukraine. Discussions around supplying Ukraine with ATACMS precision missiles with a 300-kilometer range are ongoing. Getting these weapons would give Ukraine a further advantage over the Russian army. But for now, the United States has acted carefully in terms of providing Ukraine with long-range missiles, since Washington fears that this could lead to an escalation by Russia,